Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andris Sprūts, and I'm Director of Institute of International Affairs. And of course, I'm very happy today to welcome all of you at a discussion, book presentation on Russia West in changing security environment. We met with some of you 2 weeks ago at newly launched and we believe very successful Riga Security Forum. And we had also the good discussion on debate actually on West and Russia. And this is to some extent continuation. But you see 2 weeks have passed and world already has changed. We have world leaders meeting in New York City. But at the same time, Donald Trump is facing the process of impeachment. Boris Johnson is facing again Parliament. European Union and European Commission is in permanent transition. So what we see, apparently, only Mr. Putin is permanent. Well, we can discuss at least for now. We can discuss also, of course, this one. Even though I would like to add that Riga Dialogue format is also quite resilient and relevant, and long-lasting. It's already for 5 years we are organizing these discussions. The main event is in May, so when we invite high-level experts, international ones, when we have also decision makers present, and then I think it's a really good discussion. A lot of disagreements, a lot of different opinions, but for us it is important to engage, for us it is important to speak, to have a dialogue, because I think even if you disagree, you can speak and you can show self-confidence in this. So we keep with sustaining Riga Dialogue in May, but as a follow-up, we have also the Riga Dialogue Afterthoughts presentation and discussion. So when this is, once more, you are welcome on this. This year, first time, the publication is virtual. It's in e-format. So one of the agendas, one of the important topics was climate protection. So we protect climate as well a bit. So we try to go climate friendly in that direction. So you can find the publication actually by making the picture of the QR, and then the publication will be downloading on your smartphone. All this is also in an informal setting. I think it's important to have an engaging format, so please be active, be dynamic. I think it's also quite a short presentation, just for 1 hour. So we encourage you to be part of the whole debate. We are very grateful to our partners. Always special thanks to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. I think we have excellent partnership with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and all of the flagship issues have been supported and partnered by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. But also, of course, we have other instrumental partners such as Nuclear Threat Initiative, European Leadership Network, Latvia's Zelsearch, and also the Russian partner, Russian International Affairs Council. Unfortunately, the representative from RIAC was not able to come today because she got ill. So things happen from time to time. And with this, actually I was supposed to moderate this, but I'm resigning as a moderator. And I'm giving the floor to Elizabeth, because we also follow the important trend that we try to encourage as much as possible gender balance. So Elizabeth is instrumental in this regard, and that's why we change a little bit of our sort of setting of the panel. So I invite for active participation and, of course, wish a lively debate. So thank you so much. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Andris, for this speech with some progressive notes even. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am really happy to welcome you to the annual Riga Dialogues Afterthoughts presentation. This year's topic is Managing Crisis and Strategic Stability in the Euroatlantic Community, and we're going to be talking exactly about the management of relationship between West and Russia. Once again, please use the opportunity to have it in your hands. Use the QR code, and as Anders already said, we are also trying to use more technology-driven, environmentally sustainable solutions, so you can enjoy and appreciate our publication digitally. You can also download it on the homepage of Latvian Institute of International Affairs in the publications section. Indeed, the United Nations General Assembly gathers on the other side of the ocean and discusses urgent matters, and on both sides of the ocean we still seem to be 2 minutes before midnight. As claimed by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and I'm quoting, "Humanity faces two existential threats, nuclear weapons and climate change, that are exacerbated by the information warfare, putting the future civilization in extraordinary risk." Now, I also have some good news, but before that, I would like to invite you to participate, as one of Leah's targets is actually to achieve more participation and engagement from our audience. So please use the application Slido. You have the name on the presentation slide on our background, applicationslido.com, and you have to enter the code E518, hashtag E518. And please try to answer the question, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about the Russia-West relationship? It can be one word, just an association that comes to your mind, please. In the meanwhile, the good news is promised. We have an excellent panel of speakers today, 2 Europeans and an American. Once again, we're missing the Russian counterpart. But I believe that our panel will maybe be able to overturn the rather alarmistic note I started on, and perhaps also the concerns that we could hear in New York just yesterday. Ambassador of the Republic of Latvia to France and former Minister of Defense Imants Liedis. Maybe a round of applause for our speaker. Head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe, Reinhard Krumm. And non-resident fellow for Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Storycroft Center for Strategy and Security, Robert Noreck. So thank you very much, and perhaps let's start with Reinhard, some introductory thoughts and ideas.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Lovely day that you take an hour, not only ambassadors and excellencies and members from the Sejm, but also students, which I think is very good because we're talking about your future, the security in Europe, that's you. We will die before that, but you will live for quite a long time. It is a privilege, I think, for people like us here on the panel to be able to travel quite a bit. And I've been to Berlin, as one does as a German. I've been to Lublin and now coming to Riga. And so I'm a little bit having some thoughts. You don't get a presentation, which I have here, but I would like to reflect a little bit on that. Going to Riga, going to Lublin, going to Berlin is loaded, overloaded with history. Especially going to Lublin. You go a road down from Warsaw to this lovely city and you're in a very good mood, and then you see the city and you see the history of the city, and as a German you get rather depressed. It is the long shadow of history which is still there. Riga partly too, and Berlin too. I'm coming to this because a former Latvian president pointed that out in May when we had the first meeting. He said, history is the compass of each country. And he pointed those out, which the numbers, the years for Latvia, 1939, and I don't have to define this, you know this, 1940, 1941, 1945, 1990, 1991. They're partly painful history, it's partly joyous history for Latvia. And this goes for Poland, this goes for Germany, of course this goes for the US too. Question is, how important is that? Is that the anchor we need? Do we have to look back and this is the anchor, or do we need this as a good foundation and look forward? At the moment, I think history is almost putting us down. Think about the EU. If we would have started just looking back, Germany would have never been a member of the EU. And this is, I think, something we should think about. And this is basically my main point. 30 years next year after the OSCE, KSCE, Paris Charter for a new Europe, the mood was excellent. It's called For a New Europe. The end of history was implied. One united Europe. Latvia is part of this united Europe, but then Europe is not united. We still have a line which goes eastwards. And this is one of the big challenges we still have. And this is what we're talking in Riga about. That's what we talked in Berlin on the Eastern Partnership about. And that's always, and we also did this in Lublin. We're not finished yet with a new Europe and possibly a free Europe. The question is how to get there. And my impression is that we have to think how much we want to invest into this initiative, or we don't. Are we happy with the status quo? Is it okay, even though not so far away in the east we have a war going on, or at least an armed conflict? Is this good enough? Are we doing all we can do, or do we need more? And I would argue, as some others would, it's not good enough. The question is how. And don't expect from the expert any answers. If you look into the last 30 years, I think you have hundreds, possibly thousands of analysts writing on this. RAND, the Latvian International Institute, the Small Ebert Foundation, Brookings, you name it, it's all there. So what's missing? Clearly it's missing the link between politicians, diplomats, experts, and the population. So maybe, and you hear this again and again, maybe it's time to open up. Maybe it's time to talk about foreign policy more with the people. You might argue, and experienced diplomats might immediately argue, well, you know, it's a difficult subject, what do you expect? But it seems to be, if we are really the opinion that we need a free Europe, a united Europe, a whole Europe without borders, we have to do something. Yes, the major challenges, climate, nuclear, we all have. But I think in general we are looking towards our own region. We have to do something on climate a lot, as a matter of fact, but we also have to do something to get Europe together. And this is something we should think more about, and I would be happy to discuss this, or we would be happy to discuss this. What is it that we can open up more to the public? And I will finish with this point. The German Ministry of Foreign Affairs did 2013 a review process. Amazing. The German government thought, why don't we ask international experts what we, Germany, should do in foreign policy? Just imagine that in the US or in Russia. Impossible. The Germans did it. I can't tell you that the result was fantastic, but at least there is an idea what we want and what other countries would like us to do. If one could do this also with the public, what is it that the public wants? According to a couple of opinion polls in the US, China and Russia are not the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threats. It's going down. It's not that far. If you talk to political Washington, they're way up on the top. So how do we bring this all together? How do we make sure that the public is more in tune with foreign and security politics? Is that something which is completely crazy or not? Think about climate change. Think about the young woman who is going around and make sure that we understand what we have to do. Maybe we need something, that kind of ambassador on foreign and security politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard. Now, looking at our background, we see that the word unpredictable is definitely gaining some traction. There is talk of Cold War, undeniably. The relationship is seen as essential, yet confrontational. The word uncertainties, nuclear threats. And a question, is there a way forward, is seen on the slide there of your associations and perceptions of the relationship. Imants, maybe you could continue.
Yes, thanks very much. Thank you to the Institute of International Affairs and other organizations for inviting me along. I've been involved in the Riga Dialogue since its inception. Very pleased to be here again. Although, you know, I grew up in an age where there was no digital, and I thought that I was, and talking about unexpected, I thought that I was coming to a book presentation, but it transpires that there's no book. But nevertheless, I'm very pleased to offer some thoughts. And my contribution to the digital version of our focus on relations between Russia and the West, I used the quote from a Latvian poet, Rainis, who in Latvian talked about pastāvēs, kas pārvērtīsies, and a loose translation of that, which cropped up during our Riga Dialogue in May, was survival through change. So there have been, to my mind, some changes during this year. Whether they're positive or negative, that's open to discussion. And one of the first that I focused on was the fact that Russia rejoined the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Latvia's delegation, along with others from the Council of Europe, which is a fundamental European organization based on human rights and values, voted against the return of Russia to the Council of Europe, to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And interestingly enough, the decision to vote against was unanimous because one of the delegates of the Latvian delegation of the Parliament from the Latvian Parliament to the Council of Europe is an ethnic Russian who is a specialist on human rights issues, and he also, together with his Latvian colleagues, voted against Russian parliamentarians being invited back. The rationale for inviting them back, and I was privileged to be aware of that because it was a French initiative, because they've taken over the presidency of the Council of Europe. The rationale was, well, we need to continue engaging with Russia and finding a forum where we can continue to have a conversation. And this is in spite of the fact that Russia was refusing to pay its contributions to the Council of Europe and threatening to leave the organization. So, to my mind, there was a bit of a success by Russia using these tactics to get themselves back into the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. And obviously, we're all interested in dialogue, but the question is, what's the cost of making concessions and reaching out towards our Russian partners? And this, incidentally, since I wrote the contribution, has become even more of an interesting issue, particularly in France, because through the initiatives of President Macron, who before the G7 meeting in Biarritz in August, decided to invite President Putin for a bilateral meeting in his country, residence by the sea, and had a discussion. And we saw that at the G7 meeting, President Trump was immediately advocating Russia rejoining G7 and it becoming G8 again. And the question is, well, what has Russia done to deserve coming back into the club? It applies equally to the Council of Europe as it does to G8, and I throw that open. Once again, the question of dialogue and defense and deterrence, that is the set policy of all NATO member states. It's the NATO policy of having a dialogue with Russia, but ensuring that deterrence and defense are bolstered up, and hence, because of the events of Russia illegally annexing Crimea and the ongoing war in eastern Ukraine, we have today in Latvia a plethora of countries, NATO countries, contributing to the enhanced forward presence, and this is the defense element of NATO, which has come about because particularly of Russia's activities in Ukraine. So that's one aspect, and I think another interesting aspect of change during this year has been the elections in Ukraine itself, where last year we were already hearing from Russia vis-à-vis the Normandy 4, which is the format, again, kicked off by the French with Germans and Ukraine and Russia participating. The Russian partners were saying that they're not going to be doing anything this is what they were saying last year, because there will be no movement, because, look, we've got presidential elections taking place in Ukraine, there's going to be parliamentary elections after that. Well, they took place, and it's right that after the election of President Zelensky in Ukraine, and with him also being very successful in the parliamentary elections, there has been a window of opportunity, and I think this window is being recognized also by Western partners, certainly President Macron. There is a theory that one of the reasons that he wanted to get engaged again was because he saw that Russia and Ukraine are beginning to talk with one another directly, which is Zelensky's conversations with Putin after he was elected, and you know, making efforts to engage with his Russian counterpart. So those are positive developments in many ways, and the other change that I looked at was the opportunities this year that have been presented by the international events that were taking place. And I refer to the G20 meeting in Japan, where, once again, President Putin, when he went there, he was very successful in his diplomatic outreach to partners. He had bilateral meetings with Trump, with President Macron, probably with Chancellor Merkel, etc. So these are the changes that have taken place, but my gut feeling remains, and is the fact that if Russia really needs to qualify for becoming a partner again, a serious partner, then it needs to do something itself and not just sit back and wait while the West and the leaders of the West say, oh, well, we can't carry on with businesses, we can't carry on with this state of affairs, you know, we must try to do something, and whether it's the Macron's version of restart or other things. And so Russia's position seems to be working quite well on that respect, and for us it's a little bit worrying that Russia itself is not making any great effort to move or explore ways of moving ahead with the difficult situation that we find ourselves in as a result of their aggressions in Georgia, Ukraine, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Imants. And this actually makes an excellent transition to my next task to you, dear audience. On your table, you see 3 little pages. One is green, one is red, and the third one is yellow. Now, I will ask you to pick one of each, or try to share them between you in order to answer the question that we already asked you last year. So, Imants, I think, introduced this very well. What do you think is going to happen with the West-Russia relationship? So, the voting green would mean it will become better, voting red would mean it would become worse, and voting yellow would mean it would stay relatively the same. Please, I see that these pages haven't been touched yet. On that table over there, please. And do make a vote. We will have another round of voting at the end of the event, and we'll see if we've convinced you otherwise. Is everybody ready? Okay, so what does the audience think? Is the relationship going to become better, worse, or stay the same? Yellow, yellow, I see yellow, stay the same. Green, there is a provocateur in the room. Going to get worse? I think it is overall a couple of votes for saying it's going to get better. I think it's going to be interesting during the round of questions then. Thank you very much. Don't lose the pages, we're going to have another vote in the end. Now, Bob, maybe we can ask for your introductory comments.
Is this, it's working good. First of all, I have to ask you to please excuse my rather informal attire. When I flew here from Washington the day before yesterday, the airline managed to lose my suitcase. So we'll see if I ever see it again.
A sabotage, I'm sure.
Yes. I've been asked to give an American perspective on this issue, on relations with Russia, but with particular attention to questions of strategic stability and crisis management. And to save plenty of time for discussion, I will do this in more or less in headline form. And let me start with, first I'll say a few words about the broader context as I see it in Washington, and then raise a couple of these more particular issues. So first the context, and start with the obvious. As I'm sure you know, the impact of Russia's behavior in and around Ukraine starting in 2014, and then the interference in the US election in 2016 has really had an absolutely dramatic effect on the mood in Washington, on expectations about what is desirable and possible in the relationship with Moscow. And to summarize, I mean, after a lot more attention to other parts of the world and to questions like counterterrorism, a couple of things are back. Defense is back, NATO is back, and Russia is back. All of these issues are much more central, again, on the security policy agenda than they were even a few years ago. Now, one corollary to all this is that, of course, there's increasing concern about and attention to the security challenges in this part of the world, the Nordic-Baltic region, eastern part of NATO. And you've all seen the results in terms of US and NATO decisions, enhanced forward presence, and so on and so on. In that sense, these issues, again, are now much more central to US security policy, and particularly defense planning, than they were. And that's not going to go away, at least not for the foreseeable future. And one result is, I think, when I get asked, as I often do, about prospects for U.S. engagement, particularly in defense and security in this part of the world, I said, you know, my answer is, I'm much more optimistic about that than I was even a few years ago. There's very strong bipartisan consensus and a very partisan atmosphere about the need to do this in the Congress, in most of the bureaucracy, and in the broader policy community. Now, having said that, there are a couple of caveats. One is that, as always, the U.S. also does have a global agenda. And any administration, including this one, is going to have to make choices at the margin about its priorities and where it directs its attention, its resources, and the like. And Asia in general, but China in particular, is a much heavier and weightier consideration, which is one reason why the issue of burden sharing in NATO is a very neuralgic issue in Washington. And it did not start with Donald Trump. It started really before him. I think actually NATO countries, including most of them in this region, have a perfectly good case to make. So I don't see a tragedy in the offing, but it's an issue that has to be handled. The second major caveat is, in talking about engagement, I'm really thinking about day-to-day policies. As I say, it's not that Trump can't do anything different, but if he tried really to change things in this area, he'd pay a very heavy political cost for it, for the reasons I mentioned. The exception, though, is, and this refers really sort of to day-to-day issues. If there were a really deep, serious crisis, where as president he had to make decisions about deployment of forces and so on, I don't know what he would do. And I don't mean to suggest one thing or the other. I can imagine him overreacting or underreacting. Because frankly, with what we've seen on most of these issues, the way he reacts, it's all about him. It comes from his stomach rather than his head. So I just don't know. I mean, that's one area of uncertainty. The second is that, you know, again, given this change in the context for the relationship, although Donald Trump still talks about cutting a deal sometimes, about really changing the fundamental nature of the relationship with Russia, I think there's, at least in principle, interest in this on the part of Mr. Putin. I don't think there's much optimism in Moscow that this is going to happen. There are occasional feelers. There was a very big one shortly after Trump became president. We get them occasionally, even now, but I think basically for the foreseeable future, we're going to be managing a very difficult relationship. So I would have held up a yellow card myself, but the yellow means it's not good. This is, having said that, management means, among other things, there are a couple of areas where I think we really need to re-engage with them, and the agenda is pretty narrow, but not trivial, and it's really in a number of sort of hard defense and security issues. And let me mention a couple having to do with the topic here, namely strategic stability and crisis management. First was strategic stability. There are two big nuclear issues in the relationship. The first has to do with the fact that the INF, so-called INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, has dissolved. I regret this greatly. We can talk into. I was involved in my youth in putting that treaty together. So I'm sorry to see it happen. It's not going to be revived. And the question is what to do about it and to prevent a much more destabilizing arms race in the region. I can talk about what I see in Washington, about some of the planning there, what I'm seeing in Moscow. It's not that I think that it's inevitable that things are going to get really terrible, but I think it has to be managed, and there's some basic issues that have to be dealt with to keep it under control. The second on the U.S. agenda, of course, is strategic arms control, namely the future of the so-called New START Treaty. As many of you know, that's due to expire in a few years. It can be extended for 5 years. It doesn't have to go back to the Senate. It can be done by presidential authorization. A lot of people ask me, when I say, yes, I think it's very important to extend the New START Treaty, they ask me, well, why do you care about it, given everything else going on in the world? The rest of the arms control regime is falling apart, the relations are terrible, et cetera. And my answer is that's exactly why I care about it. That given everything else going on in the world, the last thing in the world I want to see happen is to lose the elements of transparency and predictability that we have in strategic nuclear weapons from that treaty. That's number one. There's a second reason, too, which is another argument that people make about the current nuclear arms control is to say, well, you know, it's sort of outmoded. It deals with a set of issues that have changed. Technology, in particular, has changed enormously. There's cyber, there's long-range conventional precision strike issues, there's space issues. My reaction, that's true. And a second reason to extend New START is to buy time, to think hard about how to deal with what's a changing technological environment. Because we know those issues are looming, but we haven't figured out how to deal with them. So that's the second issue. Then finally, and just a couple of observations about some current issues which really affect things here, which I think also need to be addressed and have a lot to do with crisis stability. And this really has to do with U.S. and NATO engagement in this, military engagement in this region and corresponding Russian military presence along their western borders. One big issue has to do with the nature of that presence and what could possibly go wrong. When people ask me, what's a scenario which could really produce trouble, the one that worries me, it's not that I think is likely, but the one that I think is not as implausible as I'd like, is a situation of really extreme tension where NATO has a very big exercise and is sending a lot of troops into the region as a scheduled exercise, and perhaps in response to a similar exercise like the one we've just seen from the Russians, which starts a spiral. Now, I mention this because NATO, in fact, one result of NATO's focus on other issues before 2014 was that NATO hadn't practiced reinforcement for a long time. It hadn't done very much of that, and NATO's policy in this region, including its deterrence policy, is basically a reinforcement policy. So we have to practice it. It's not there, no question. We have to have these exercises that bring troops in, that change, that test the logistics, that test host nation support and the like. But we need to do it in ways that don't cause more trouble. And one question that I and many others have raised is, can we disaggregate this? That is, can we do this in pieces such that over time we are confident that we've practiced all the pieces that have to be practiced, and that the pieces will fit together. And we're starting to see this in NATO. NATO's not doing everything all at once. I mention this, it's also interesting to note, this is an area where I think we need to talk to the Russians. And there's been very recently, you talked about the European Leadership Network, they've just produced a very interesting paper by General Brzezinski and a colleague of his. Those of you who know of General Brzezinski, he's no softy. But it's a very thoughtful paper that addresses precisely this issue. He has some ideas which I think would not be acceptable in the West, but they have to do with some confidence building measures and so on, about the nature of presence near the borders, about the nature of exercises and so on, which I think are very much worth discussing with Russia. So we don't have to accept their proposals, but this is another area where I do think we need to re-engage. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Bob. Now, perhaps a straight-up follow-up. Now, you mentioned the post-INF world, and our colleague from the European Leadership Network, Lukas Kolesa, also wrote in his paper for the Riga Dialogue Afterthoughts that we're facing a crisis within a crisis within a crisis. It is the overall breakdown of the arms control frameworks that is within a crisis of the West-Russia relationship and within the crisis of the post-Cold War order. Where does China stand in all of this?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's another area that everybody agrees we need to do something about, but nobody knows quite how. You will have seen, if you've seen the debates in the US, and to some degree in Russia as well, there's a lot of speculation that despite what everybody's saying, that one of the real reasons for the lack of US interest in preserving that treaty, and for that matter, the lack of Russian interest, is worries about China. There are worries about China. And so some people said, well, let's trilateralize this, or multilateralize this agreement, bring China in. And indeed, Russia had proposed something like this some years ago. In current, at least as a formal arms control treaty, that is with limits on numbers, the Chinese have made clear they're not interested. Because they are, yes, they have nuclear weapons. They are a fraction. They may be 10–15% of U.S. and Russian levels. So if it would be very good to have a lot more, a lot clearer idea of what they're going to do. It would be very nice if we had some understandings and assurances from them that they're not going to continue to build up too much. But that's, so maybe we tried to have some so-called stability discussions with the Chinese. There have been some track 2 meetings like this. They've been interesting and unproductive. And the Chinese are very wary about getting involved, at least formally, in understandings like this. If we ever come to an understanding, it's not going to be in the form of a formal limits on numbers. We may get everybody to agree on some norms about what we advertise, how much transparency we give to everybody else about our plans and the like, but I think that's about as far as it goes.
Thank you very much, Ima. It's time for your reaction, but perhaps also a quick follow-up. Yesterday, President Zelensky, during his speech, he actually had the great example of his showmanship. He took out a bullet, and he said, well, this is then what is happening in the 21st century in Europe. Do you think that he's still the reason or basically the key to sustainable peace in Ukraine?
Well, the president? Yeah. Well, I wanted to make some comments on China because I think it was good that Bob mentioned China in his presentation, and a couple of comments on China. The first is that both in my ministry not far down the road, there is an increasing recognition of the importance of China strategically. There is an increasing push for China to go onto the agenda in debates within NATO. And one of the reasons that President Macron said about bringing in Russia once again to discussions was that he was concerned that Russia may use the opportunity to move further towards China as opposed to towards Europe if he was given that choice. So those were my comments on China. But I mean, briefly on President Zelensky, I think he does hold the cards, and he's already, to my mind, has proven to be quite an effective operator. I mean, I watched some of the Sky News interview with him and President Trump, and I must say that he handled it extremely well, with humor, and he has, as I mentioned in my presentation, already reached out towards President Putin. So, and I think within Ukraine itself, he has this window of opportunity where he said that he wanted to get things done vis-a-vis relations with Russia and bring an end to the war. And if he doesn't come up with some goods within the first year, who knows where things will go.
Thank you. Reinhard, some comments perhaps?
Not a special question?
In fact, yes, you mentioned climate, and I think this is quite a big topicality. Perhaps also for the West-Russia relationship, could this be one of the issues where both sides could come together?
Also something small on China. I think in general, and you said it, the understanding is China and Russia coming together, meaning they are very much in line. I would doubt that. I think Russia understands its limits. Russia doesn't want to be a small brother or a small partner of China, which basically they are. China is economically very strong. Russia is military stronger. But I think for Russia, it's an embarrassment that since 1989, China has boomed incredibly and Russia hasn't. That makes, I think, a very difficult partnership. Also, Russia is in general interested in the Asian market, and it's not just China. So I just want to point this out. It's very complicated, and the expert community in Russia and also the politicians, I think, they understand that this easy partnership with China is anything else but easy. Concerning climate, that's difficult. Russia is still supporting the climate protocol, but on the other hand, as you all know, the industry of China is everything but green. And to improve that costs a lot of money. There are issues which Russia understands concerning climate change, but deep down, I think Russia is hoping for positive changes. This is a very cold, and this is very simplifying, but I heard this from Russian politicians, and not the last league, but the top league. Russia is a very cold country, so climate change would possibly open up for them. That's their understanding. So I don't know if Russia in general really understands the difficulties there will be. I think there's a certain hope that it's one of the few countries which possibly profits, if anybody can profit from this extraordinary change, which in general I think just is disastrous for us. But I think there is still some hope in Russia that finally something works out for them.
Thank you very much. I believe I heard the speech of President Putin saying that it is positive for Russia because they will be buying less fur coats. So that would then be the positive outcome for it. And now, please, I'm opening the stage for questions. Mr. Eitzmanis, please. Sorry, Bob, you have a comment, and then we will go to you.
Yeah, just very quickly, I thought I'd add, first of all, I'm hearing some of the same things that Reinhard is hearing, although I think it's a very early discussion in Russia, and it's quite a confusing one, but that they are saying, well, this may be good. I just mentioned that one issue that this doesn't create, but that it is intensifying in terms of Western Russian relations has to do with the Arctic and the high north. This is an area which for years we've been saying, fortunately this is one area we've kept demilitarized, let's try to do it. That's getting difficult. And one of the underlying reasons is the Russians have started to build a lot more infrastructure along their coastline. And for a long time, it was possible to say, well, you know, this is perfectly reasonable. This is what any country would do to be able to, you know, monitor and monitor the coastline as it opens up, to do search and rescue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as defined by the Arctic Council. That the sorts of things we were seeing were perfectly consistent with, you know, what you would expect a country with that long coastline to do. It's gotten harder now. There's more stuff going in that looks like it may be crossing that threshold. So this is, again, it's early, but this is another issue where, again, I think we have an interest in coming to some understandings, but we need to really re-engage with them soon to make sure it doesn't, things don't go, to use an expression, don't go south in the north.
Thank you. The microphone? Yeah. Please introduce yourself as well.
Hello? Working? Yeah. Just about the north, the problem isn't the part from the Kola Peninsula to the east, it's the Kola Peninsula, that's the problem. What else I was going to say? Yes, it's unfortunate we don't have a president from Riga here, because the question I wanted to ask was what's going to happen now until 2024. That is, with the change, or possibly not change, in the leadership of Russia, where Putin either steps down or finds some other way of hanging on. But my reading of what's going on in Moscow at the moment is that there is a fair amount of infighting now among the political elite in terms of what all this means, you know, after 2024. And I was just wondering to what extent we can expect either Putin trying to make sure that he's managing that infighting that's going on and not doing anything strange outside, and in fact maybe even trying to, as he did in Ukraine, to make some kind of effort at appearing that over the next while there's going to be a Russia that is more, how shall I say, stable or willing to talk to the West, or as the usual routine is, as things get kind of hairy inside, he's trying to do something dramatic outside in order to pull the country together in some way. Because these years to 2024 could be some element of destabilized situation, but that's what I would like you to talk about.
Thank you. Perhaps another question?
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Hamid Lajavardi. There's an old saying that a good, responsible citizen is an educated citizen. You talked about the interaction between the experts and the people, and I'm all for greater interaction. But as we know, the world is developing towards a greater complexity, and more so every day. Given what we have seen, such as the Brexit referendum and other referendums around, it seems to me that it's becoming more and more difficult to get the degree of understanding by the public to confront and have an educated opinion about complex issues. How do you propose to overcome this issue where, on the one hand, the issues are getting more and more complex, but yet the educational level for understanding the complexity is not there?
Thank you. Another question? If not, then we will turn to the panel. Please take the question that you find most appropriate. There is? Fantastic. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is David Haribal. I'm a student and I had a question. We've discussed about the nuclear threats, and I had some questions about I think Russia, the Russian Federation is getting second world and second polar world. They will have some allies, and they had some drills a few weeks ago, and I have a question. They are getting a war. They are getting ready for a war, or what?
Thank you very much. Now 3 questions. We're going to come back to the panel. Imants, you want to start, please?
I want to start with answering the last question because I think that there is something that was referred to as the Gerasimov doctrine, which essentially says that Russia is at war all the time. I mean, Russia is at war in Ukraine, we know that, but Russia is conducting a war in the information space, the cyberspace, hybrid warfare, and I think that because of that, perhaps the anticipation is not so much that the aggression will be military, but more an interference in the established democratic systems, as we saw in the elections in the United States, presidential elections in the United States. So I think that's it's a good question. Secondly, on Yanis's point about are we entering a dangerous period of time because things are becoming unsettled in Russia, and will President Putin use that to try to keep things under control internally by going out, into some adventure? Difficult one, because you're sort of asking us to make predictions, and it's impossible to make predictions. If I could predict something, I wouldn't be sitting here now, but I think you're right to refer to that. Are we in a dangerous situation because of the increasing internal turmoil within Russia? I think it's right to address that question. And the other issue about making complex education, making complex issues simpler, I think that's also a valid point. And I recall a conversation just the last week in Paris about how, on the one hand you have the populists who say, look, they complicate things, Brussels is complicated, and, in fact, we need to just make things very simple, and this is the yes and no answer, and that's how they gain support. But I think the thing to do with that is to try to also counter that argument, but by making the complex questions more simple in a way that is not populist, but in a way that is sort of anti-populist. Let me put it that way. And a final word on climate, because I noted that I was going to say in my introductory remarks that Latvia was chairing the Council of the Baltic Sea States during this last year, and one of the issues on the agenda at the closing meeting, ministerial meeting in Jūrmala, was in fact climate issues. So, there was climate, there was space and cultural heritage. So you see that, I think there are dialogues taking place in other fora vis-a-vis climate, which is increasingly coming onto the agenda.
Thank you very much. Reynard, and then.
I would like to start with the public. I agree with you. The idea is not, because I don't think the public is so much interested in foreign policy, but at least to make sure that what we, the European Union and the US, well, the US at the moment unfortunately less, but in general, understand about cooperative security, meaning together. We cannot secure ourselves alone. WIWS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, did a report on how much would it cost us if NATO doesn't exist, or if the US gets out of NATO. Horrendous money. We shouldn't do that. So cooperative security, this is what the OSCE stands for, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is what the Helsinki Final Act in 1975 stands for, together. And I think that is a topic for the public to understand, against populism. Because some of the populists are saying, let's do it alone. That's what Britain is saying. Let's do it alone. We can't. And now I'm talking pro domo for Germany. Germany can't. We cannot do what Great Britain did before as a great power, what France did. Germany was never like that. So for us, cooperative security, being together, this is it. And I think it's worthwhile to talk about this with the German people. I'm now talking, in this case, only about in Germany, but I think in Latvia it's the same thing. In Latvia, maybe it's easier to understand that a smaller country has to work together. But even for a bigger country like Germany, there is no German way. This is it. This is together. So that's what I meant. And I think this is not too difficult for the public. I think public is smart in general, partly. About Russia 2024. As a matter of fact, we're just working on a scenario project with a couple of experts. Andris Spruc is part of it. And we had a long discussion, what are the factors which influence Russia in the future? And hundreds, clearly. And we came up with a strong and a weak state and a strong and a weak society. And if you do this in a quadrant, you come up with one scenario which says strong society, strong state, weak state, and so on and so forth. And from that, you see that the predictability about Russia is, as always, very difficult. But the quarrel we had was, if the situation is getting difficult in Russia, does that mean that the president stays on or not? Or the other way around, if everything works fine, is then the president stepping down? So we are working in our little capacity on the scenarios because we agree with you, with the questionnaire, that is something which at least already now we should put our thoughts into. Having lived in Russia for quite a while and dealing with Russia also for quite a while, it is so difficult to say if what we see in Russia right now, partly of society getting really annoyed what is happening, is that something which will grow or not? Looking into Russian history, one would assume it goes up, but it will die down again. But we don't know, because Russia today is something which we have never seen before. Navalny, the opposition politician, you know, he said Russia right now, he said this a couple of years ago, I think, but it's still true, has never been so free as today. This is coming from Navalny, with all the caveats, what's not working in Russia. So Russia is weird, and it's extremely difficult to predict because Russia has never been in this position. On the one hand, as Navalny said, on the other hand, repressive. Outside, aggressive partly not aggressive. What do you make out of this country? That's just a huge challenge for all of us. But I would like to make a short point on the Gerasimov doctrine. Doesn't exist. I think there's a huge discussion on this. Mr. Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the Russian army, had a document, and from then on, experts jumped on that. It doesn't exist. The guy who came up with this doctrine, Mark Galeotti, a British scientist, actually excused himself and said, actually, there is not a Gerasimov doctrine. I'm pointing this out because this is one of the challenges we face. How active is Russia? How strategic is Russia? Or how reactive is Russia? I think, and I would like to say this even though the time is coming up that we stop almost, and we cannot discuss this, Russia is not strategic. We think it is, and we make Russia bigger than it is. It's painful for a couple of countries, unfortunately. We have to deal with this, we as the European Union and we in NATO. But in general, I think, for some reasons, we overestimate Russia.
Thank you very much. Bob?
Well, a lot to talk about. Let me do this quickly if I possibly can. First of all, on the last question about what's Russia up to, what do we make of these drills, what about the Gerasimov paper? First of all, on the drills, no, I don't think Russia is preparing for war. They want to send a message that if something bad happens, they're ready, but it's not because I think they want to initiate anything. This would be a disaster for them. And I think they know that. So they're walking a line here. As for the Gerasimov, the famous paper that's gotten so much attention, it does talk about Russia being at war, but it's because what the West is doing. And not, and indeed an awful lot of what we're seeing, including we're trying to affect domestic politics and so on. It's annoying, it's infuriating, and it ain't new. We've been seeing stuff like this for decades. It's particularly strong now, but I agree with the observations to say one reason it's strong is that they're I think, trying to be very careful not to engage in so-called hard defense issues. They're trying to keep below that level. There is a lot of attention, some of you may have seen this, to words, the so-called, looking at nuclear policy, about escalate to de-escalate. The Russians talk about this and people get very excited about it. Well, I'll say a couple of things about that idea. First of all, there's nothing new or unique about it. What they're describing is something that was very similar to NATO policy during the Cold War days. This was a time when we felt we might lose a conventional war. And a lot of the discussion about NATO nuclear policy was what could we do to stop things. And when I say it's not unique, escalation, all the arguments about escalation have turned about whether you can control it, not whether or not you're trying. The assumption has always been that what you're trying to do is stop things. Nobody's ever said, we're going to escalate in the hope that the other side will hit us back harder. You know, you've always wanted to do it either to get the other guys to stop or to win. So there's nothing new about that. That doesn't mean that we ignore this, I think, in the Russian case, but it's for a very particular reason, and which does affect defense planning, and that has to do with the difference between the force balances, the very local force balances in the east on the one hand, and the more general regional Russian NATO balances. Russia, for obvious reasons of geography, if they wanted to, they have advantages, just numerical advantages along their border. And they would under any conceivable scenario. So they could do things. They could do things locally and regionally. It would be an enormous risk because when NATO got involved and brought forces in, they would get clobbered. But this notion of escalating to de-escalating, the role of nuclear weapons, it's worth paying attention to because, again, I think it's very unlikely. But the one kind of scenario that is not quite as implausible to me as I'd like is if there were really severe tension, if Russia tried to carve off a little bit of territory, say in northeastern Estonia, and then said to NATO, don't do a thing because this could go nuclear, this would be a huge dilemma. But the answer to that is not, I think, not more Western nuclear weapons. It's to fix the conventional balance, to make this even more risky than it's risky enough now for Russia, and we ought to keep it that way. Very quickly on the leadership question, I like Reinhard. I agree. It's hard to predict these things, and the Russian debates themselves are very confused. I mean, even in the aftermath of the recent protests. On the one hand, people that I know who are very sympathetic to this are very glad to see it, but they note two things. Number one, they're actually smaller than they were some years ago. And number two, they're very pessimistic that it's going to produce change for a couple of reasons. One is that they see the administration cracking down, which they are. And number two, they say, we don't really have an organized leadership. There's no, what we hear very often is there's nobody in the opposition, as much as they like Navalny, there's nobody in the opposition who's going to really be able to pull things together. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Kremlin is asking as if they're more scared than the opposition is. They are cracking down as if they want to stop this now. So again, I don't know where this is going to go. Both sides seem nervous and slightly pessimistic about it. There is what has changed is, and which is worth watching. I'm not going to make a prediction based on it. It's two things. Number one, there is a lot more open discussion about life after Putin in Russia. Again, it's in particular circles, but I don't remember seeing it at least publicly before the way it is now. And two, there has been a reaction. Some of the protests have gone beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's also new. We haven't seen much of that before. Finally, very quickly on the question of the public and in particular foreign policy. It's very hard to do. I agree. I mean, people in the U.S. have worried about this too. There are some some NGOs have tried to go out and outside of Washington to talk to people about foreign policy issues. It's too early for me to say how much of an impact they've had. But the bottom line is going to be, I think it's very important to do it. But the bottom line has been historically, and I think for the foreseeable future, unless people really worry about an imminent conflict, or worry about spending, that's not how they vote. It's domestic politics that drives things, and that's going to continue to be the key factor for most people, and it's understandable why.
Thank you very much. Now, very shortly, we have time for maybe one or two short questions. So please. Please take the microphone and introduce yourself.
Martin Chandersons. There's one word that I haven't heard in this conversation that I think touches upon Russia, China, and economics, Russia and the US, and as well, of course, Europe, and could potentially serve to unite the dialogue or divide the dialogue in terms of strategic stability. And that word is energy. Nord Stream 2, liquefied natural gas, bypassing Ukraine. These are phrases that I'm throwing out not to open a can of worms, but if I could ask the panel if we were to do a yellow, red, green vote in terms of energy and its potential for disrupting this dialogue or actually improving the dialogue, how would each of you vote?
Thank you. Is there another question, perhaps? Please.
Carlos Bukovskis, Latvian Institute of National Affairs. I'm going to use the opportunity and continue the long-standing tradition of us asking questions at our own events. I was wondering if any of you could comment on what is Putin's unfinished business? Meaning that if we look back at the 20 years of his consolidation of the state power, of his putting Russia back on the map, taking it up from the knees and everything else that has been taking place, retaking the economy and creating the power vertical and controlling the military, I was just wondering if we are talking actually about his term and his presidency and his rule ending in 2024, he's most likely thinking about his legacy. So what is the unfinished business? How do you think in your mind what is still left there, what he wishes to do in these 4 or 5 years which are left there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, gentlemen, who would like to take which question? Imants.
In answer to Carlis, I would say that hopefully his legacy won't be related to what he said about the greatest geopolitical tragedy or geostrategic tragedy of the last century being the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Thank you. Bob, perhaps?
Very quickly, I mean, he thinks it's a tragedy. I think he understands it's in this world it's not going to be recreated. What he does want, and he's been very explicit about it, is to get Western recognition of Russia as a great power, a world power with a seat at the table over every issue that matters to them. And they're very frustrated because they haven't gotten it, and I don't think they're going to get it, at least for the foreseeable future. So that's going to be a big part. You know, that's one reason he's looking for a deal with the U.S. and occasionally makes these little offers, because he sees, you know, U.S. as the standard bearer there, and he also misunderstands how decisions are made. I think a lot of people there think decisions are made in Washington as the same way they are in Moscow, that if he can convince Donald Trump, then nobody else has to be convinced. Not the way things work. I think other people in Moscow understand that well, but I'm not sure everybody does. One part of his legacy before had been the economy. And he had basically, you know, he'd basically cut a deal before, which a lot of Russians liked, which said, as long as you guys stay out of politics, we're going to make your lives better. And for a while that was true. The economy was growing, you know, it was very uneven. It wasn't the same in Moscow as it was in Tomsk. But the economy was getting better, people's lives were getting better, they had more access to the West and so on. Well, things are stagnating now, and one of the big arguments among Western scholars is how constraining is that going to be? And what will they do about it? So people mentioned about is he going to deflect attention? Is he going to do something terrible abroad? I can't rule that out. Again, very risky. I can imagine places where it'd be a little bit less risky, but the places that are less risky, that is, which are outside of Europe, outside of Asia, also would have a lot less resonance in domestic politics. So I don't know. But I think that's going to be one of the big issues it clearly is a big issue in internal debates in Russia about what do we do about the economy, because they understand that most people understand that to really get growth going again, they'll have to make some reforms which will have effects on domestic political power in ways that Putin may not like very much. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Reinhard.
I wanted to avoid that answer, but since my predecessor didn't answer the energy question, I guess I have to do that. I have to tell you, it's the classical question about Nord Stream 2. There's no conference without Nord Stream 2. In general, I would say that if you look at oil, gas, coal, and renewables, looking at Germany after the incident in Japan a couple of years ago, there's a huge energy reconstruction going on in Germany. And one of the reasons Nord Stream 2 will be built, and not only actually with Germany, is to support that. Because we need more gas, and Ukraine will get gas through Nord Stream 2, by the way. So that is something which is going on. It's a huge struggle in Germany, it's a huge struggle in the EU, and I think now the German government understands that communication was done very badly, doing something and saying take it or leave it, which is not good. If there's so much concern about that, one should talk about it. But in general, I think it's not a bad thing, and that's no final answer. You could argue, and I would do that, as much as we need gas from different sources, so does Russia need money for that. And again, there's a huge controversy. Do we need to depend on each other or not? Sanctions work because we depend on each other. If everybody's working on it alone, we don't have any sanctions. If we don't have any sanctions, well, the next step would be military use, which fortunately we don't have yet. So I would put a yellowish-greenish mark on that, positively.
Thank you very much. Now, very nice transit to my next request to you. Has the climate in the room changed? Please vote on my question. Will the relationship with Russia get better, the green one? Will it stay the same, the yellow one, or will it worsen, the red one? Please. Don't hesitate, huh? And still there is some more green I see from here. But still, I guess the vote is overwhelmingly yellow, so we are probably remaining in the status quo. The discussions are ongoing, and luckily for that, we hope to see you next year in the Riga Dialogues Afterthought event, where we can actually discuss this. Once again, thank you very much to my wonderful panelists. Thank you very much, dear audience, our partners, as well as Cynthia and Chris, who have been the main force behind this event. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next year.